Hey, everybody. Today we're going to address one of the common questions, which is what exactly is meant by physical violence in the definition of election violence? Let's do the whole definition as a reminder. So, when we're talking about election violence, we are talking about physical violence, severe psychological violence, or property destruction of monetary or symbolic value that is either motivated by an election cycle or else intended to influence an election cycle. So let's focus in on that physical violence piece. What does that look like? One of the most obvious examples in sort of international terms is assassinations. If you have an assassination of a candidate or a staffer of a candidate or a family member of a candidate, then that's definitely going to meet the definition of election violence. But those are less common than several other forms of physical violence. One of those is when there is a non-violent protest or gathering of some kind going on, and the security sector acts out of either poor training or poor intentions and ends up escalating the violence in a situation that was either entirely nonviolent or mostly nonviolent before. We can hope that this doesn't happen, and in some countries it does not, but in some countries it does. And so that kind of police escalation of violence is one way that physical violence sometimes happens in the context of elections. Another possibility is that the protest or riot itself simply is physically violent, that there are people being assaulted, that there is use of weaponry. And if this is happening with or without the presence of the security sector, that is an example of election violence. And a third possibility is when there's a protest that is legitimately nonviolent, but then that is interrupted by violence. And sometimes the violent group of people is in opposition to the nonviolent protest, and sometimes the violent group of people is in solidarity with the cause of the protest, but they're coming in because they believe that the violent option is going to be the more effective option, which it is not, by the way. There's really good evidence for nonviolent protest ultimately being much more effective than violent protest. So physical violence. There are a couple of other types of physical violence that have popped up in other national contexts, but it's my general understanding that these are not likely to happen in the United States. Basically, we're talking about either assassinations or police escalation or violent protests or nonviolent protests that are disrupted by violence. That's what is meant by physical violence in the definition of election violence. The next time that we talk, we'll focus on another strategy, and that strategy is youth programming. That's next